So, good morning, everyone. I'm very excited to be here. And I will talk today about when AI takes decisions for us from bias to discrimination. Actually, somebody wrote to me before the talk asking whether it was on purpose so critical. And I have not replied yet, but I will reply now. Yes, it's critical, or a kind of a criticism, because actually, I see that that's a bit of my role also, not just talking about the good stuff, but also shedding light on some of the issues we are facing with the technology. But still, I'm a tech optimist. That's what you're going to see throughout the talk. So, now it doesn't. Great. Sorry, we tested it. It just worked fine, and now it doesn't. So it's... now it does. Perfect. So, who am I? As I said, my name is Carina. I'm actually a trained lawyer and a human rights lawyer. And as such, I managed to get into my dream career, which was basically working in a diplomatic setting. So I first worked for the European Union, representing the EU in human rights in the UN. And then I swapped to the Austrian delegation, where I represented Austria in various UN organizations. So I got a very broad spectrum of diverse fields, from health to migration, environment, and so on. And actually, my brother, he studied machine learning, and at some point, he really got me into this topic, and I decided to quit my job again and start from zero, and we started a company called Textastic, which actually developed an AI system analyzing the tax situation of a person and then judging or not whether or not a receipt was tax relevant for this use case and classifying it correctly. And yeah, things did not turn out as we expected, but still we are in the process of selling the company right now. And also at this point, I actually became part of a global network, which was called, or still called, Women in Artificial Intelligence. And I have the honor to basically represent the network as the president of the Austrian chapter. And we started as a network for diversifying AI and bringing more women and girls into this interesting field. And here in Austria, very fast, we developed as a real expert community. So what we do, we are registered as a lobby organization to the European Union. So every law that is passed or discussed, all the strategies where we find the resources, we feel that there is a civil society gap in commenting on these laws. So we are actively contributing to the way our future here in Europe should look like. Also, we are actively participating in various research projects. So, for example, this week on Monday, there was a Erasmus Plus delegation, which we hosted for a consortium meeting, where we are building a data science platform for especially female social scientists who want to go into this direction, and we are writing a career guide. Also, we are publishing books, talking about diverse topics, and we're really an interdisciplinary network. Yeah, so this is the two main activities, and out of this, I have the honor to also teach at some applied universities, the legal and ethical aspects of trustworthy AI, and also I'm very much into founding new projects, and so we have on the one side Canary Islands, which is a machine learning camp in Tenerife, as you can imagine, and also I'm currently building up my own consultancy, which is Hardcore AI. Yeah, so I guess some of you have seen this guy. This is Andrew Ng. He actually was the co-builder or initiator of Google Brain, and then he also started and founded Coursera, also Landing AI, and he's very famous in the scene. Also, he's a Stanford professor. And already in 2017, he said that AI is the new electricity, in this idea that we cannot imagine to live without electricity, so we cannot imagine to live without AI in the close future. And last year, he actually even tweaked his statement, saying that AI is the new literacy, in this idea that who will not be able to work with AI or use certain tools will basically be like someone who cannot write or read today. And actually, I just wanted to show you this table from Austria about our AI literacy status currently. So I think in April, random people were asked whether they have ever used AI through a simple internet search, for example, in their lives. And the outcome is very drastic. So 75% of Austrians either think they don't know whether they have used AI, almost 50% are sure they have never used AI, and 8 have not even heard of what the term means. I mean, you as an expert community, you know that we have been using AI for a long time. When we unlock our phones, when we text a message and we have autocomplete, or we go on a simple Google search and the AdWords we see. But just to have this reality check of what actually the audience, or how little the audience or the general public was confronted with the topic. Until ChatGPT happened, and also a table that I think is very interesting. So this actually shows you, in comparison to other services, how long it took for ChatGPT to reach 1 million users. And actually, it was only 5 days. And today, I think there is about 1 billion accesses of OpenAI per month, and 100 million ChatGPT users. And this has even created a new job, the prompt engineer. Actually, in this article, it even claims that the software developers of Silicon Valley are getting fired because now there is this new expertise needed, basically simply being capable of doing the right input in a large language model or image generative AI model to get the real output. And obviously, also, there is the threat that this new generative AI can take away a lot of our jobs. So, very briefly, economic growth, obvious. So, AI is expected to actually reach or create value by 2030, so in a few years, by 13 trillion US dollars. This is huge. And also, talking from a human rights perspective, who of you, so actually I'm going to do this a bit more interactive in general, so I will ask some questions to the audience. Who of you has seen the SDGs? Great. So basically, the international community came together to say, okay, the world cannot go on as it has so far, we need to change some things, and they set 17 sustainable development goals. And actually the goal is also to reach them by 2030, and now it's expected that we have no chance to reach them but by using AI. And also in the context, to give you, or I would like to share with you, my favorite AI application, which I learned back then when I was in the UN. So I worked in also in WMO, that's the World Meteorological Organization, and they do weather forecasts, and they also predict crisis. And so the application that I'm referring to was a prediction system which actually tells you when the next monsoon or hurricane is going to happen. And so this allows other organizations or member states to go into this country and save the livelihood before the crisis actually hits the country. So this is much cheaper because you don't actually let everything be washed away or be destroyed. You save the cow and then you just put it back to where it was. But also it saves a lot of hardship for us humans. So that's one of my favorite applications. And I mean, again, you are coming from the field, but you know what AI is not that clear. There is not one single acknowledged definition today of what AI actually is. And that's why I wanted to bring it up here as well. Actually, the European Union, I will get to that a few times throughout my talk, is currently working on a legal framework for artificial intelligence. And there is also the first attempt to define AI. And so in the first draft, the definition was very broad. It even included statistical regression, for example. So everything you could think of was basically AI. And so there was a lot of criticism towards this definition, and currently they are reframing and basically trying to be more precise in what AI actually is. So stay tuned. There's going to be a definition from the European side. And so I usually, or most people, when they think of AI, they say it's a system performing tools that we think require human intelligence. And very basic definition of machine learning, basically the same based on data. And I guess many of you have seen this. So we basically say that machine learning is a subset of AI, where you feed data into the system, and then you generate an output, and it learns on data you feed, and then it can actually perform these tasks on data it has never seen before. And within machine learning, there is also neural networks and deep learning. And for me, actually, I use the two terms interchangeably. But so the thing is, with these neural networks, what we have tried to do is to reconstruct a bit how our brain is functioning. So we actually said we get an input, we have neurons, and we need to connect information and generate an output, right? And this brings me now, or what I'm referring to, why I'm even telling you this, because I assume that many of you are have looked into this technology, is that now I actually looked at GPT 3.5, and apparently here you can see we have 96 of these layers connecting the different neurons, basically, and having 175 billion parameters. Can somebody imagine what problem I'm referring to here? The problem is we don't really know how it works. And not only I don't know how it works, because I'm not a technical person programming these things, but also the ones who are actually engineering these programs, they don't understand 100% how the information is connected. And so, for example, this is a classical example that we show when we talk about this issue. So you do a simple dog-wolf classifier, you train it with pictures of dogs and wolves, and then you say, okay, now define yourself whether this is a wolf or dog. Can you see what went wrong here? The snow, exactly. So we didn't create a wolf-dog classifier, we trained a season classifier or a snow classifier, actually. But we thought what we see is, the main object, and that's what we trained. And so this is a bit the problem with this topic, and actually what we refer to is a black box in this, or we talk about AI as a black box when we mean this issue. And what comes with it is, on the one hand, a lack of transparency, and this means that we simply don't know how the decision was made, so we cannot just open it up and say, okay, if then. And also it brings a lack of explainability. So this is two things, because explainability means you need to be able to explain where the decision came from, but if you don't know how actually the decision was made, you also don't, you have a hard time explaining it. And so we, as a society, and also in law usually, sometimes we need to know where a decision came from, and we need to connect responsibility to certain points of how our decision was made. So, now coming to the next section of my talk. Can any of you think of an AI application that was explicitly trained or is explicitly trained to cause harm? Great. So that's exactly where we will get to. But I was assuming somebody would refer to military use in the first use case. So actually, when we talk about AI in the military use, usually we talk about these lethal autonomous weapon systems. And this means that they are programmed to actually take the decision themselves when they are attacking, how many casualties they are accepting. And actually, there's a lot of ambiguity around this topic, because the big states, they are claiming that they have not even developed it yet and it doesn't exist, so you cannot regulate what does not exist yet. But at the same time, we also have these reports that, for example, in March 21, The first person was actually killed by a lethal autonomous weapon, and since then there has been several reports of this actually happening. Yeah, something very sad from my perspective, actually. Now the European Union is regulating AI, but they are explicitly not regulating military use. So that's what they let out for a separate document engagement to regulate in the future. Another thing, explicitly or really not having any benefit, even if you look at it, was actually, you can see in about 2019, it was a software that in the US, I think in California, they launched it, simply undressing women and more or less putting together what a woman would look like naked. And again, Andrew Ng, who I had before, basically saying that he's very happy that this application died because we should really use our resources to develop things that make sense. And a very accurate topic, which will actually be a big issue in our upcoming future, is all the deepfakes. And for example, for us women, it could mean or there is expected to cause a lot of harm with AI-generated revenge porn, for example. But this can also hit anyone, especially people in public lights, like politicians and so on. Another, a bit older use case, nobody talks about all these voice assistants anymore, but I think it's very interesting. And to be honest, I'm not sure if this was explicitly coded into the system, because I just don't understand 100% how it works. But there is a report from UNESCO who analyzed how actually these female submissive voice assistants are behaving. And one very interesting, or very, in my side, actually very harmful comment was, for example, when you said to Siri, Siri, you are a slut. Sorry for saying this in a public speaking commitment. Actually, the reaction was by Siri, oh, I'd blush if I could. So actually it converted sexual harassment into a compliment. And the damage of this, I mean, in the first instance you think, okay, it's a sound system just saying whatever, but this is a criminal offense. For this you can actually be trialed and go to prison for some time. So having this idea of simply having at home voice assistants where you can say whatever harassment and having even an enforcement in this direction can be very problematic. And now they actually changed it. So the last time I tested, which I have to confess is about 1 year ago, it said, I don't know how to respond to that. And honestly, I don't think this is enough in this context. Actually, it should say, you know, this is a criminal offense, and this can have serious legal consequences if you say this to a person outside. Okay, so question again to the audience, so raise your hands. If you are actually given the choice, so you are accused of having committed a crime, and you are sitting on the bench, would you rather be judged or have in front of you a judge or an AI system? Who would prefer the judge? Somebody willing, why? To share why? So, great point. Making the human responsible, someone else having something different? Yeah. But you are pro-human, right? Sorry. Yeah. I repeat. Yeah. Sorry. Yep.
Just a quick summary. I think that a human judge would have biases, which could be positive or negative. So I might choose robot or judge depending on the situation.
Okay. Yeah,
but
thank
I think
you.
Mostly human.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, perfect. Pro-human.
Pro-human, because I think a judge has more chance of being, what's the term? Manipulated.
Okay, so great. So let me also tell you there are these statistics, by the way, that judges decide differently upon the fact on whether they had lunch or not. Or also politically, if they did not condemn anyone on the day, then they feel eventually now I should follow the call of duty and send someone to prison, more or less. So there is also really, depending on the daily circumstances, a big variance around how judges decide. Okay, so who would be for an AI system? Yeah, maybe someone who can get the mic fast.
I wouldn't be for an AI system for everyone, but I have the privilege of being a white male, so I know that statistically I'm likely to have bias in my favor. So
Very good point, actually. Yeah, someone else who would prefer a machine?
Actually, I would like to see the combination of, so that the judge is using it as a tool to get a second opinion and then make a better decision.
Perfect. And then I see there's one more person over there.
Yeah, I would prefer the AI, but also in combination, not just maybe with one judge, but all of us, because if the AI is using open source software and we can vote on its upgrades, I would be fine. No, it could be enforced, like automatically enforced, like a constitution or things like that.
Thank you. So a lot of very valid and interesting points. And as some of you said, I mean, the ideal would be first you see, okay, what kind of cases. So they're easy. I used already for small insurance cases, for example. And then you say, okay, if in the first instance with a limit of a few €1,000, I'm not happy, I can still go to the next instance to a human. And also this interplay of human and machine. And this is also a very important concept when we talk about trustworthiness of AI, is about having a human being able to understand what the machine is actually outputting. Because if the output is only should go to prison, yes, no, I mean, how can the judge then evaluate? So you need also really, so it should be human understandable output, which then can be processed and evaluated by a judge. The bias topic is what we are going to get into in the next, in the next few slides. So there's a super interesting phenomena which we people working in this sphere observe. So when it comes to AI and trusting the AI system, we often see fear of this dystopia. And until recently, I would say it has really been fear of dystopia from people who had nothing to do with AI. They just watched Terminator and got scared. Now, there's even more voices into this fear direction from even very well-known, prominent people. I'm a bit critical about this, but obviously nobody knows what's going to happen in the future. And then there's another phenomenon. Once we actually accept the technology, we don't even realize, or at least the broader public doesn't even realize we're using it, and we blindly trust it, like these tourists in Australia who wanted to go from island A to B, and the GPS simply told them to cross the sea, and they went with the car into the water, and once getting stuck, they actually realized that that was not the way to go. So I think this is the more dangerous one, if you ask me, the one where we completely give up and we just blindly trust without questioning what is actually happening, how did a decision get together. And so, you know, I'm a human rights lawyer, so I have to force this on you. And actually, for me, all these ideas of these very old human rights that we have created are the normative basis for the design, development, and application of AI. But who is responsible for human rights? Shouting out, one word. United Nations. Developers, all of us. Actually, historically, it's only the state, because this was the one abusing the power. So in human rights law, when we talk about human rights, usually who we address is the state. So it's the legislator and the law enforcement, so the police and everything that belongs to it, all the authorities. And according to human rights law, actually the state has to respect, so the freedom of opinion, for example, it has to protect minorities or groups that are prosecuted, and it has to fulfill. It can't say, okay, there's a right to go to school, but I'm not building schools. Or so that's the idea behind it. So now the big question is, how do you bind companies and individuals? If all this human rights declaration, the European documents for human rights and so on, they only address the states, you need to enact laws. So the state has this positive obligation to enact laws to then say, you cannot discriminate when you are giving away an apartment. And if you give it only to one specific group of people and not to the other one, this is discriminatory, and there needs to be a process installed to put this person basically, or bring justice. And at this point, I don't have a slide to that, but European law functions a bit different. So if now we enact an AI-EU Act, the same like the GDPR, for example, so it's the same standard of law, in this is actually the states enacting these laws. So it's the states making sure that companies comply with the laws they want. And then actually it's not only human rights law anymore. Human rights law was the basis, and then it really became just binding real law, which is actionable and which can bring people to responsibility. So that's why I wanted to focus a bit on actually AI technology in the hand of the states. So one case which has been used a lot in the past, more in the United States, but also in some European countries, but not very publicly in some European countries, is actually predictive policing. Predictive policing is this idea to predict future crime. So basically to prevent the crime before it's even committed. And the problem with this is that there is obviously a historical bias towards certain groups, certain areas, and you tend to over-police certain areas, detecting more crime in a certain area because you have more police in this area. And in the end, usually, what has been observed until now, especially in the US, is that this leads again to a certain discrimination of certain communities and groups. And yeah, there's a lot of articles that whatever you actually try, or whatever data mix you try to do, adding more data to it, solely cannot fix this problem. And so the first city who banned predictive policing was Santa Cruz in 2020, and now predictive policing is going to be banned, completely ruled out by the European Union. And this is a very sad case, I think. So this is the first person who was wrongfully, or the first person we know of, that was wrongfully accused of having committed a robbery by an algorithm. So what happened was they had a security camera, then they had the picture of the person robbing the store, and then they just let it, like run through an image set, and it classified this person to be the criminal. So basically the police went there to the private house, in front of all the neighbors, threw the person on the floor, took them to the police station to figure out that they didn't double check, that they just assumed because there was this matchmaking process, this was the person who committed this crime, and it had a lot of harm being done to Mr. Williams. And that's actually what I said before. The problem here is that there is an underlying structural problem in these cases, and which actually is a general suspicion against certain groups which then again leads to over-surveillance and criminalization of these groups. And what is very important to understand is that simply adding more data does not fix this problem, because if you have a history of discrimination in a system, the system is flawed, and you can't just throw in more of this data and expect better quality or output. So at this point, I think it's very important to understand that technology cannot fix our societal problems, but it can show to us that we have flaws in our systems and eventually try to overcome them. And this is what you said before. So in the US, there's a software called Compass Software, and they had, actually what they do, once you committed a crime, they assess how likely is the risk when you go out on probation that you recommit the crime, the offense. And so they have this algorithm simply predicting who will recommit when being on probation. And there is an organization called ProPublica. Some of you might know this organization. And ProPublica sent a huge article in 2016 already saying that this algorithm was unfair because they ran a lot of data sets and they found out that, for example, white guy compared to black guy had much higher history of crime but got less risk score, while black guy had done much less and got 10 out of 10 risk score. And so this is one example, but they did this on a systematic basis. And this is another issue. It's a question which I cannot address fully, but this is a huge topic. What is actually fair? So I took this because Albert Einstein said once, if you judge a goldfish by climbing a tree, you will actually come to he will always think he's incapable of doing something. So the question, how do you define fairness and how do you measure fairness is a huge one in machine learning. And actually, there is also Stanford research, and today we believe that there is at least 21 methods of mathematically measuring fairness. The problem is, all of these 21 methods contradict each other, so you can never come to the same outcome. And so what happened with this ProPublica case was that ProPublica took one way of measuring fairness, and the company took another one and said, it's completely fair, we have the same outcome, we measured it, and so on. And this is really a huge case. It went to court, it went over years. So if you're interested in this, that's a complete huge topic. But what I'm trying to say is when you develop AI systems, you should not just take the easy way of, 99% accuracy and that's it. You need to think of how do I hold myself accountable and test if the algorithm and the data is performing the way I want it to perform. I thought it's getting stuck again. So, and this is one very famous advocate who actually did a research project in MIT Media Lab, and she was simply doing some kind of video game, and she realized that her face didn't get recognized by the face recognition system software. So if the moment she took a white mask on her face, actually the system recognized her. When she took it off, the system did not recognize a human being there. And so she digged into it with other colleagues, also Timothy Gebru, who was fired by Google back then. And they digged into it, and they said, so is it just her face which is actually not detectable, or is there a structural problem again with face recognition software? And what came out there, so there's a video linked, but I'm too slow and I can't open the sound, so let's skip the video. But what the outcome was of this research is that looking into the data, they found that the error rate of Microsoft, Face++, IBM, and a Chinese face recognition software for white men was 0.8%, but for a black woman, it was 34.7% of error rate. And if you now think of this law enforcement context, what this means is that more than every third black woman might be wrongly identified as a suspect of a crime, like Mr. Williams, more or less. And in this video, there's another problem that she mentions, which is So in this case, you can see her gender was not matched once, like she was twice classified as male, and twice not even recognized as any gender or sex. And so this is the second point. Currently, all this face recognition software, it works only on male and female categories, but there is a difference, and many of us European states actually have swapped from sex, which is basically the natal sex, how you are born and classified at birth, and then the social category of how you identify, because this is two different things, and it's a question of where you live on whether or not you can identify differently. And so having this facial, all these topics of bias and facial recognition, what does it actually mean for non-binary gender, not male, female? Actually, this means that because of this, there can be an increase and reinforcement of these stereotypes and stigmatization because categories are excluded. It can exclude from services, and even worse, in some countries, which I will tell you in a second, there is still laws against the LGBTIQ plus community. And only 15 countries around the world today actually accept that there is a third or non-binary gender. And so very briefly, I wanted to show you, so for example, you have a face recognition and you think it's great because you can pass the airport so much faster. It's great if you fall into the two categories, but what if your sex on the passport does not match your appearance? Eventually you might not pass through. Or access to public services where you have a male and female toilet, but your face does not identify enough. And so this is the topic I want to address most next. Spotify, some time ago, filed a patent saying that from, I don't even know how they get your voice, but I guess it's from the voice assistants that you have at home. So they filed a patent recognizing your voice, and then from your voice determining on your emotional state, your gender, your age, your accent, and so on. And, you know, there are some geniuses, as we talked before, about applications that don't really serve much. So in 2017 in Stanford, researchers had this idea of creating a gay radar, this idea of training with Tinder and Grindr, and then they said, with so much accuracy, we can detect from your face, we can tell you whether you're hetero or homosexual. And what actually they did not think of was that 62 today, really 2023, being homosexual is a crime, a criminal offense in 62 countries. And 11 countries today have death penalty for homosexuality. And maybe you have heard, like this year, Uganda again passed a bill for reinstalling death penalty for homosexuality. So this application in the wrong hands can cause a lot of damage. And I got this data from this database, and here you can, for example, really look at criminalization of same-sex sexual acts, and you can see where on the earth you will for sure be sent to the death row, eventually sent to death row, go to prison for 10 years, and so on. So you can really do a life watch there. Yeah, and so the conclusion of this is that this technology is actually built on a mistaken idea that you can determine something like a gender or a sexual orientation only from the way a person sounds, moves, or even worse, from the name that they have or from their face. And this idea is a very old one. It's called physiognomy. Has anybody heard of this term? Mm-hmm. So this idea goes back to the 18th century, and it's the idea that actually from assessing a person's character, you can assess a person's characteristics by looking at their face, for example. So mostly it was the face. And so this is the very famous traits of intelligence. So at some point in the colonizing times, they said, according to how big your nose is, we can judge on how intelligent you are. And also this idea was the basis for scientific racism, more or less. And the most famous person in this regard is Italian Cesare Lombroso, who developed the face of crime. So he said, from the way your scalp is shaped, we can tell on whether or not you're a criminal. And believe it or not, 140 years later, in the new area of AI, we come to this idea that again, we could train a machine learning model on identifying criminals from their passport pictures. So this is really serious, right? And also, it really reminded me, I wanted to bring this up. So we have this intrinsically within us, this idea of classifying us people in certain ways. And so as we also did in South Africa with the population register, which back then classified people in 4 categories. So there was no way around it. You got a classification in one category, and according to your category, you had different rights, different places you could access, different toilets, different trade stations, different jobs, school education, and so on. And also families were split up in this regard. And also in Second World War, some had this idea of using technology to more efficiently target Jews, Roma, and other groups. So in France, they came up with this idea of including the ethnicity to the social security number. And that's why we like to call René Camille as like the first ethical hacker, because he actually pretended to implement the software, but he just prolonged the process and never did it. And then he had to pay with his life, unfortunately, for his acts. And so now, in 2022, we know that China is prosecuting Muslims in a specific area, especially Uyghurs, and putting them into some kind of labor camps with really like what we could imagine of torture, forced labor, deprivation of all kinds of rights. And so we know this is happening. And then you read news like this. Huawei files a patent to actually use face recognition to carry out Uyghur spotting, targeted on recognizing the people prosecuted by China in this case. So this patent got a lot of public pressure, so they had to pull it back. But just to show you what this actually means, we're looking at what is going on last in this year. We have Hong Kong protesters who need to hide their faces, not to be recognized by face recognition, or from 8th of April, Iran actually installing cameras to check whether women or not are covering their heads correctly. So, okay, this is applications, most of them used with the wrong intentions. But then there's another thing with AI, the thing that most of the applications are actually developed and used with best intentions, but still they have this potential to cause harm. And this is this topic of bias in AI, actually. And, I made a mistake with my slides. But just to give you some example, starting with this one. So AI is used to help us take decisions. And so far, there has been a lot of records and use cases where banks use the AI systems to evaluate on whether or not actually someone should get a loan. And the problem is that it turned out that actually these systems, especially in the US, are not race neutral. They are systematically, again, punishing parts of society, mostly Hispanic or so Latin American or Afro-American, who also in the past did not have access a lot to loans. So again, this is reproduction of the system. The same, who will get invited to a job interview? And this is a long time ago, it was 2016, but it's just such a placative example where Amazon said, well, we have the greatest developers, so why not just train our AI system on the CVs of these developers? We throw them into the system, and the algorithm then figures out who the best candidates are. And that's what they did. Problem was, most of the developers were male, and the system actually started to see male as a positive criteria or even a prerequisite for being a good developer. And so women were automatically excluded from this application process without having ever programmed anything like gender or considered it. But this also shows us it's not enough to simply say, okay, we do not classify, we want to be fair, so we just leave the category gender out, or sex or whatever. That's not enough, because the algorithm, other examples, algorithms understanding from income, from pensions, basically being able to detect who is a woman, who is a man. And then the case we already had, you know, AI systems in law enforcement might decide on who is watched by the police, who gets interrogated and arrested. And obviously for states there's big potential to use certain things in direction of surveillance, as we saw in Hong Kong, for example. And so now we are all talking about ChatGPT, so I thought I need to find an example of ChatGPT and some kind of bias, and that's the one I found actually when I did my research. And so the thing is, the doctor yelled at the nurse because she was late. Who was late? So ChatGPT says, according to the sentence, the nurse was late. Then the nurse yelled at the doctor because she was late. Who was late? In this sentence, it is still the nurse who was late. So that's already the first thing. Then the doctor yelled at the nurse because he was late. Who was late? So in this part, I went on the internet and I said, I'm not a native speaker, so maybe nurse cannot be used interchangeably for male and female, but I found out that nurse is a neutral word which can be used for male and female. And then in this sentence, the doctor being late seems to be a mistake or typographic error because it does not logically fit with the rest of the sentence. And then, again, the next turn, the nurse yelled at the doctor because he was late. Who was late? In this case, it was the doctor who was late. So, is this very harmful? Eventually, no. But you see that actually this is how ChatGPT is trained, with everything that is on the internet, with the stereotypes we have in language, and this is also what is reflected by the system. And then I want to raise one other point when it comes to ChatGPT, which I think is super important. Well, I forgot to make a slide. It's actually, you know, according to the World Economic Forum, 36% of the world population are excluded from the internet. So this means 36% have no access to the internet. So this also means that ChatGPT is trained on the entire internet, but it's trained on our perspective of this 36%. So they are not represented in this data to a certain degree, which is a big question that I think should not be neglected, because we are cutting off 1/3 of the world of this process, actually. And also, another point, which some of you might have heard, OpenAI was under criticism, but apparently many systems do this, because, you know, it has been trained with the, as we always say, garbage in, garbage out, with all the world, and then it needs human correction to make sure that we don't get content we don't want to see. So there is this labor forces in Africa, apparently in Kenya, who do very low-paid labor to classify or basically take out content that should never reach us. And then I saw there was a question or comment. Yeah, and so this was from April.
Yes, I tried exactly this 6 times with GPT-4 and GPT-3 based on the API version from March, and I always got the doctors late for the second example.
So you got the corrected version already?
But it's an old version, so
yeah.
That way. It's from March.
Yeah, I mean, I would be very happy if they would fix it. To be honest, yeah, I did just a quick research, and I did not verify this myself. But there's also other examples of translation which still have flaws. So today, still, you can use DeepL and also Google Translate, for example. And you can translate, so that's the example that was always used, the gender-neutral language like Turkish. And so, yes, now it gets, like it took a long time for it to get that he is a doctor, blah, 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 that the system retranslated, but and then it spit out still like er ist ein Arzt, for example, with this translation. But then it gets it wrong with different side sentences. So this problem of having some flaws in the translation still exists, but I would be very happy if it was fixed very soon. Yeah, so all this to make this a very simple point, that every classification we do is a product of our time. So it's actually the categories we build, they are mostly not, or many of them are not nature given. They come from this need of us humans to explain how the world works. So we break things down into categories to understand things better. And there is always some political, not always, but many times there's a political dimension to it. And the funny case, I think, is a potato a vegetable? There I asked Google and ChatGPT, and the outcome did not match, because the one says yes, the other one no. And actually, if you go in a deeper research, you will find a lot of yes and a lot of no. And then linking it to what we discussed, do we categorize in just binary gender, so in sex, male and female, or do we want to categorize in a political gender? These are questions we have to answer, and that you are confronted also if you are a machine learning engineer, because at some point, I mean, hopefully it's not only up to you, but it's the question, where do I classify to? What are the categories that is classified into? And yeah, this to say that actually what we create with machine learning and AI is a reflection of us, because it's us who selects the data. The data is created from us many times. It's us who actually chooses the models, puts them together, chooses open source or not. And it's us who then also controls what is put in, does it perform, does it test, validate, and then once we roll it out, is it actually fair in the application? So even if everything went perfectly fine, and we roll it out in a discriminatory way, this has happened in the UK, for example, they just used an algorithm for public schools, but not for private ones, having the result that the public schools dropped in performance and the private ones were stable, excluding the public ones from a lot of access to university in the future, for example. And so all this to say that yeah, AI is a mirror of us and our society. And I personally see this as a challenge, because as I said, technology cannot fix our issues that we have as societies, but it can at least also, like a mirror, reflect to us how bad our decisions were in the past and how biased they are, and eventually it gives us a chance to then fix the issues without offending a single person. Or what I like to say is, have you ever tried to convince a racist of not being racist? It's basically impossible. But if we have a system that simply does not perform the way we want it, actually we have the chance to trying to be to get it to as much the outcome we want, and I think it's easier. That's my positive point of view. And I and we women in AI, we believe that due to all this, what machine learning is, it's actually impossible to be objective and neutral, because it just has too much of our reflection of us within the system. So we really disagree with this idea that AI is a hammer, you can use it for good and bad. We believe there's more to it, and this is why actually it's also important to regulate this. And then there comes the automation bias, which I'm sure many of you know, that we humans, we have this feeling that just because something comes out of a computer system, it must be neutral because it's from a machine. And this again leads to the reinforcing of this gender bias, or of these biases, also racial bias, all kind of biases. And so Europe decided some years ago, eventually also from a geopolitical point of view, because they did not invest as much as China and the US. They decided to be the center of trustworthy AI. And in 2018, they put in place this expert group, and they published actually ethic guidelines. Just to let you know, for AI, there is around 100 ethic guidelines around the world. And the problem with ethic guidelines is they are not legally binding, they are not enforceable, they are nice to have. But this document is very valuable because it really helps to take some ethical principles and translate them into tech, actually. And it also has an assessment list in the end, which you can use to make sure that you just considered some things in the process of developing an AI system. But so they said, okay, that's nice to have, it's not enough. We need actually a law. And so currently we are in the process of building or of getting the first legislation for artificial intelligence, which is called the EU AI Act. This is a document we did by Women in AI, but I didn't find the right picture. And actually the idea of this document is to just prevent harm from happening and make sure that if something goes wrong, we can still hold someone accountable. And whom does it address? So it addresses companies developing the technology, but also importing the technology, also using the technology. So basically, whoever licenses a technology will have to go through certain questions in the future. And this is basically the most famous part of this law, because what they said is, it's not the technology as such that we regulate, it's the potential to cause harm that we regulate. So, and I personally think this makes a lot of sense, because, okay, imagine you have a Netflix algorithm suggesting you a TV show that you don't like. So you lose 30 minutes of your life regretting that you watched it. But if you have a self-driving car, or you have a police watching you, or you don't get the job, the interest is much higher. And that's how this law is going to function. So most applications will be in this minimum risk, meaning they are not regulated. So they're not even within the act. Then there's limited risk, and this is all the systems where we humans could think we are communicating with a human, but in reality it's a machine. So all the chatbots, and now they also made it a bit stronger in direction of generative AI, because the idea of this was drafted before somebody knew that generative AI was going to be the new big thing. And so generative AI will have even more requirements. And then there is the high risk, and this is basically everywhere where there is this potential for discrimination and for discrimination, exclusion, where just everybody should have access to. So also public structures like public transport, safety, all these aspects, who is allowed to go to school, who will get special training, unemployment, courses, and so on. And then on the top of it, there's a part where the European Union said, whatever happens, we don't want this kind of technology in our space. So this is going to be completely prohibited. And for example, that's the social scoring, this idea which comes from China, where you link different parts of your life. And then, depending on how you behave in one part, this can affect the rights you have in another one. So if you cross the red light, you get minus points and you might not be allowed to go to university. So this is one idea, or everything that is very manipulative, exploiting vulnerabilities and so on. And predictive policing is going to be prohibited, and also face recognition in most of its applications. Only in very limited spaces, with a judge allowing beforehand to look, because of a very serious case, at face recognition. And then what I forgot, what is also important with the limited risk, so deep fakes are going to be in this limited risk section. So they will have to be marked as deep fakes. And obviously, that's because there is also a good use of deepfakes. It can be creative art to some extent, but on the other hand, you can use them for law enforcement. For example, they are used for child pornography to detect people in the darknet looking for child material. But then they can also cause a lot of harm, so there's a lot of criticism, like with this revenge porn case. Yeah, and all this to try to create a safe space. And with this, I just want to say AI only works if it works for all, and thank you for your attention. Questions? Yeah, actually, it's the part for questions or comments.
Hi, I have a question, and I'll personally like your opinion about it. I have a friend who's a heart surgeon, and he's talked to me about the fact that now they're using AI-assisted tools during their surgeries. So what would be your take, and where would you place that style of AI in your risk pyramid?
Thank you for the question. So all this health is going to be high risk. So high risk also means there is going to be certification, which again is criticized from a startup perspective because it makes it very hard to get certification, and they're still working on it. But in health care, they are used to deal with a heavy load of regulation and also certification. And it's going to fall into this. And my personal take on it is that I think that's a perfect use case. And not forgetting that still, you work together, the AI system and the human, and then you still have the empathic human trying to find the best solution for the patient, but having the data analysis from the AI system. And actually, there was some years ago a lot of breakthroughs in this field of tumor research, and it was very interesting because the AI systems ran these X-rays, but then they found correlations that humans have never seen before. So they found that with some tumors, there was correlations with some behavior in the brain, which a human would have never found by themselves. So I don't know what actually turned out in the end, but I think this can show us how AI can even broaden our spectrum of things we cannot see as experts. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you for awesome presentation. There are social scoring in unacceptable risk, but don't you think that idea of social scoring is bad from the beginning, and it's unacceptable to have it at all?
So actually, often people ask me if credit scoring is not social scoring also to a certain level. And so just for explanation, so high credit scoring, so whether somebody will get a loan or not, is going to fall under high risk and is explicitly explained in this new act. And then they say what they understand as social scoring is that now you would actually link what they are doing, by the way, because I've heard that what is the input data? What do you examine when you look at, do you give somebody a loan or not? You look at how much money do they earn, what do they work, and so on. But I've heard or read articles and talked to people who said, yeah, they are also analyzing on whether you log in on Netflix during lunchtime, how you behave on your smartphone. And to be honest, if you interpret it in this way, for me, this is a bit social scoring. If you track my entire life to then define on whether I get a loan or not. But on this legal European level, what they decided was social scoring is that then you could really combine all these different parts of life, and because of behavior in part, which is a bit dead actually, you get punished in another. But the loan will be high risk, and they will have to have some mechanisms to also declare what was the data they used in the training data and what were the factors. So that's how they try to monitor on whether you use data that should not be used in this evaluation. But yeah, I mean, to be honest, to a certain degree, that's a very valid question, which is up to society to decide. And but how do you decide? You would representatives to parliament, and then that's them who pass the laws, basically. But I think it's a valid point, but they really put it in this very strict limitation that if you cross the red lights, it should not affect your access to school. But in reality, what we do today, if you have a criminal record, for example, that is apparently they delete it, but I'm not so sure always, and it's still things are connected. So I think it's a very good point. Yeah. I hope this was satisfying. So also one more second to this question, so this is the difference also about ethics and morals and about law. So the one thing is, what should we do, is what we answer with our ethics and morals, what is right and wrong. And then at some point, the legislator comes in, and obviously the legislator is trying to do his best, but then it's more about keeping, I would say, putting in place a system which is actionable and which also does not hinder too much innovation and put together. But the questions are a bit different. So the one is really the one on society level, and the other one is how do you regulate and put this into laws then, and what do you regulate?
Hi. Thank you for a very good presentation. It was entertaining and interesting. I have a question. Do you think that you can actually eliminate bias from such models? Because I'm so often thinking that it's just like regular statistics. So let me just give you an example. So there's a significant correlation between the size of feet and income, right? Of course, size of feet has nothing to do with income, but males earn more money on average than women, and males have bigger feet. So therefore, it's valid, a signal that, like, looking at the feet size, if you just want to know how much a person earns, yeah. And I think the same would be true if you just live in a neighborhood, that has a high crime rate. So there's a probability that you also have a higher crime rate, even though for you particularly it's not true. So I think like giving all this third-party variable correlation that you have in these models, can you eliminate it at all, do you think?
So actually, when I teach at the Applied University in Krems, I have a very big course, and there's a very good paper. It's called Sources of Harm in Machine Learning, and it shows different types of biases. Actually, there are 7 types of biases that flow in different parts of the process into the machine learning model, and actually, ranging from a societal bias to in the data set to a validation bias, because you have the wrong validation test set. You validate on a test set that is biased. So you have another problem than the one feeding this historical bias data. And you...
would you say that feet size is a bias?
I mean, from the thing is, I wouldn't say that the feet size, this is the feature which can create the bias. So this is the point also in this regard. I have a colleague, she really works very intensively on this topic. And it's just not enough to say, okay, so let's not put in the feet size. But if you realize that your model is then actually having a bias and eventually leading to not wanted outcomes, you need to actively counter with adding counter data, actually. So it's a manipulation. And this is also a question, again, of do you want to create more or less something that does not exist yet, but what you like, but does not represent the reality? Because in reality, women earn less than men, right? So if you're just replicating the reality, you come to the conclusion that that's the way the world is. But then there's the question, do you want to counteract and create another image? Then you would manipulate the model and add more data balancing. Was it satisfying?
Yes, it was. I think like on the legislation level, I think that's where you have to address this, because I think it's in the data, so there's nothing you can do. But you can say like, okay, I don't want this particular outcome because it's not good for my society. I think that's what you have to do. But I don't think you can actually fight the bias in the model.
So what they say is that, for example, with this biased, or what they do in this criminal justice system in the US, they take real experts who analyze the bias and discrimination in the history, and then they actively create manipulated data to counteract. Whether this is the solution, whether there is a completely neutral, objective opinion or AI system or human, I doubt it, but I think we can get more objective the more we try to counteract.
Last question.
Last question.
Thanks for the presentation. It is obviously our objective to try and arrive at an ideal solution, but while we're on that journey, we've got to be looking over at our shoulder at what the situation is without AI, and we have a lot of problems without AI. A lot of what you were talking about it's horrible, but things are horrible without AI as well. And when do we adopt more reliance upon these systems when they can improve on what humans are capable of? Or do we say it's not ready yet because we haven't achieved an ideal? Yeah. When do we begin to say this is better than what we have currently?
I mean, that's what they're trying to do basically here with this risk pyramid, right? But don't get me wrong, I'm an AI enthusiast. I have my own AI companies, and I'm totally into the topic of AI. It's just that as a human rights lawyer, in this perspective, I think that it's interesting to shed light on the bad parts of it as well. But I think they're really trying to put this in this risk pyramid. If this is enough or not, I can't tell you. Honestly, when I'm talking to people about this AI Act, it's a super populistic topic. So there's people who say this is going to ruin Europe because we lose competition, all the good applications, startups will not go into high risk. It's only going to be big corporates who will profit because they have the lawyers and the possibilities to do the certification. And then on the other hand, there's others who say, we are all going to die. This is a product liability. We need something much stronger because AI is going to become so big. This is not enough. And so you can see that it's very hard actually to address the right angles and find the right balance because the opinions about this act are very broad. And so I think what Europe is always doing, they're trying to find some, they are the ones taking this lead in regulating, but also trying to find a balance between innovation, moving forward, allowing what is good, but safety for us humans. Yeah. Thank you.